Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals on Gran Turismo 6, and this particular Rivals match is a three-way battle between muscle cars, but in particular modern muscle cars. And I would say these are pretty much the three best choices of modern muscle car: the Camaro, the Mustang and the Challenger, from three big American brands. Now, of course, everyone has their own preference, everyone who likes these cars, that is, and each one of them, although similar, does definitely have its own personality, its own character, certainly its own style of delivering performance and handling, and its own advantages and disadvantages. Now, you may be wondering why the GT500 Mustang is not here, but instead the Boss 302, and primarily the reason for that is because the GT500 is more a rival to stuff like the Dodge Challenger Hellcat or the Camaro ZL1, so it just doesn't really feel fair to put it on the same playing field as these cars. But first of all, we'll break down each vehicle, and then we'll compare them. First up, we have the Chevy Camaro. Now, this is the SS model, or the Super Sport Camaro. It's the cheapest of the three at 35 grand, and it also has the largest engine, a 6.2 litre V8. It's not as powerful as you might expect though, especially given that all three are muscle cars, and of course muscle cars are typically known for, in particular, their sheer power and torque. Back in the day, they had a lot more power and torque in comparison to other cars on the market than they do now, because there are so many powerful cars now from not just America but plenty of countries that they don't really stand out as much as they used to. Now, it's kind of ironic that muscle cars on Gran Turismo, at least, have kind of moved more towards being, kind of ironically, good handling rather than great in a straight line. All three of these cars are not as quick in a straight line as you'd probably expect or hope them to be. They're not slow by any means, but for top speed in particular, they don't really even come close to even some of the classic muscle cars in terms of their flat-out performance. Now, the Camaro in particular is a strong choice. You've got great visual upgrades to go for. I personally am a fan of this generation of Camaro, and you do also have options such as the flat floor, which, as we often do, will be factoring in to this comparison, especially in terms of its PP level. What, though, about the Mustang? Well, the Mustang is a car which is fiercely popular. People who love Mustangs on the internet, it seems to hate every other muscle car. I personally don't understand that logic. If you don't like other cars, then fair enough, but telling other people not to me that's kind of dumb. It's very dumb. In fact, I have no respect for anyone who has that opinion. The Mustang is a great car, but so are plenty of others, and even if it were better than everything else on the market, that doesn't automatically make everything else useless. That just makes the Mustang potentially better. So in the case of this car, is it clearly better than the other two, or is it just another option? Well, in terms of sheer power, yes, it is better. It's got close to 900 horsepower, which is a lot more than the Camaro and a fair bit more than the Challenger, although far more than the Camaro in comparison. The straight line performance on this car is the strongest of the three. The top speed is around 10 to 15 miles per hour better, maybe a little bit more depending on the gearing. The handling is good. It also benefits from the flat floor, just like the Camaro, but it's not necessarily as quick, around this track at least, as you may expect it to be. It's around the same as the Camaro in terms of lap time, at least with me driving, and considering how much more power it has, that's perhaps not as impressive as you might assume. What then finally about the Challenger? Well, the Challenger seems to be, again, from what I've heard online at least, the car of the three which people don't tend to hate on as much. The Challenger is kind of set back from the age-old Camaro-Mustang battle. Of course, back in the day, the Challenger wasn't really in that same group. It was more of a higher-level muscle car, taking on stuff like the Chevy Chevelle. So it's just a whole nother level of muscle car, those huge big block muscle cars which were less about handling and more just about sheer straight line torque and power. Now, the Challenger doesn't stand out as much in that regard, although the Hellcat certainly does return that kind of sheer straight line reputation that it used to have back in the 70s in particular. Now, this is probably my favourite car of the three. I like the Camaro, I respect the Mustang, but I don't love it, and the Challenger I both respect and like. So I think of the three, especially in real life, if I had the option of the three, I would probably choose the Challenger, because to me it's a little bit more evil looking. The handling of the three is, ironically, I would say, the best, and interestingly, it actually does not have a flat floor. But as you can see from the lap time, again, with me driving at least, and on this particular track, it was the quickest, by a fair margin at that, despite having a much lower PP level. Now, that's one of the reasons why we don't include the lap times in a point system, because maybe the flat floor doesn't give them as much of an advantage on a track like the Daytona road course because of straight line performance. But let's actually find out which one does win on paper. Well, as we break down the individual categories, you can start to see some of the ways that we've already pointed out that each one of the three dominates. In, for instance, engine capacity or price or power, we've already touched on aspects where the Camaro may win or the Mustang may win. With the Challenger, it tends to be not necessarily dominant compared to the other two, despite the fact that it was the quickest of the three. But if you've been around with the rival series for a while, you'll certainly recognise that often the car with the least points turns out to be the quickest. So is that the case here? Well, first of all, we have the price. As we already said, the Camaro is the cheapest at 35 grand. That's a pretty decent margin, 10 grand less than the Mustang, 5 grand less than the Challenger. But to be fair, all three cars are really well priced, and that's one of the reasons why, despite being a Brit, and typically we are presented as not liking American cars, the reality is actually very different to that for most normal people, not including Top Gear. I love the fact that American cars offer so much power for such a low price. I actually consider them to be similar to Japanese cars in that regard. Japan doesn't offer huge power for the money, but they do offer that kind of performance for the money, which is why I have a lot of respect for both countries in that particular way, despite the fact that they are kind of opposites in that regard. Now, as far as engine capacity, we already touched on the fact that the Camaro does win, a 6.2 litre compared to the 6.1 of the Challenger, and then trailing quite far behind is the 5 litre of the Mustang, and even the GT500 Mustang isn't quite as large in terms of sheer capacity as these other two. But it's funny to see how times have changed, because none of these cars have engine capacities which even come close to the big classic muscle cars like the Charger 440, the Cuda 440, the Chevy Chevelle 454. They really had massive engines back then. Of course, their performance didn't get the best potential out of those engines, but they were massive nonetheless. Now, as far as PP level, both the Camaro and the Mustang, as we said, benefit from the use of a flat floor, whereas the Challenger doesn't have that option. I didn't test them without the flat floor. I just used it to see what the comparison would be, and as you saw from the lap times, it worked in favour for the Challenger on this occasion. But for on-paper numbers, it works the most in favour for the Mustang at over 650 pp, which is enough to give it the point. As far as power, again, we mentioned it earlier, the Mustang is, by a fair margin, the most powerful of the three. Not surprisingly, most of the Mustangs in the game do have really good power. Even the normal, or more normal, Mustang GT still has a huge amount of power. Of course, the GT500 does as well. As far as torque, though, interestingly, it doesn't go to the Mustang, but rather the Hemi of the Dodge Challenger. 726 pound-feet is a little bit more than the Mustang and a fair bit more than the Camaro. Kind of ironic that the Camaro is the worst in terms of both power and torque, even though the engine is the biggest. Kind of strange there, because Corvettes tend to be more impressive in that regard. But for some reason this particular Camaro doesn't really square up quite as well. As far as weight though, the Camaro does actually make up for it. Ironically, given that it does have, physically speaking, the largest engine. It weighs 1,301 kilos, which is a little bit less than the Mustang, 18 kilos less, and a little bit more lighter than the Challenger. But all three are in that 1,300 to 1,400 kilo category, although the Challenger is more the kind of weight that you'd expect from a Chrysler 300C, so it is a pretty big, heavy car, but not ridiculously heavy. It's certainly no Range Stormer or Chevy Silverado. The horsepower per ton does go to the Mustang though, because although it is slightly heavier than the Camaro, it just has so much more power that it more than overcomes that burden, and it actually wins that point easily. It has so much more horsepower per ton, the best part of around 100 horsepower per ton more, in fact, than both of the other cars, give or take here and there. And although lap times do not feature a point, as we've said, it depends on the track, it depends on the tuning, especially here with the use or non-use of a flat floor, depends on the driver, of course. But it is interesting to note that the quickest, as I mentioned, was the Challenger. Then in second was the Camaro, and interestingly, last is the Mustang. The Mustang was actually the slowest of the three, despite having the most power. Interesting to see how they compare, and of course, as I said, that is just on Daytona with me driving. Who knows, for instance, how it could have turned out somewhere else, say the Nürburgring or Le Mans or a twistier circuit like Ascari. It would have turned out, I have no doubt, totally differently. And that does mean that on this particular occasion, again, the car which was the quickest has the less points. The Challenger only came out with 1 point, and that was the foot-pounds of torque in its favour, whereas the Mustang and the Camaro both earned 3 points apiece, giving them both a joint victory. So very interesting how this particular match turned out. Certain cars do definitely have certain advantages. I would say that the Camaro perhaps has the best handling of the three. The Mustang is definitely the quickest of the three in a straight line. But possibly for all-round ability, as the lap time here at least attests, I may actually have to give the edge to the Challenger. But an interesting match overall, and not really an easy one to predict on this particular occasion. But that's it overall for this match. Of course, as always, if there are other Rivals matches that you would like to see of 2 or more cars, feel free to slap those down below. And I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.